No one expected anything unusual that Wednesday afternoon at the International Pastoral Congress in Lisbon. It was the final day of the event, and Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, known for his warm presence, humble smile, and sharp theological insights, had just finished delivering a talk on synodality, and listening to the peripheries of the church, the room of over 300 delegates stood in applause. He nodded, graciously preparing to offer a closing prayer in English. As usual, a multilingual team was on standby for translation, but then it happened, something no one could explain, not even Cardinal Tagle himself. As he bowed his head, hands folded on the lectern, his voice deepened slightly, not in tone, but in weight, and the first words he spoke were not in English, Latin, Tagalog, Italian, or any language he was known to speak. It was something else. The room grew still. People stopped taking notes. Heads lifted. One translator near the front froze. Dropping her pen, another began weeping without understanding. While the words were clear, pronounced slowly with no hesitation, but utterly unrecognizable, some described it as sounding ancient, others said it resembled a Semitic language, or perhaps something older than Hebrew itself. But what shook the room was what happened after several audience members, none seated near each other, began whispering translations. Each swore they heard the phrase in their own language: Portuguese, French, Swahili, Tagalog. Different languages, but the same message. The name is spoken not with the tongue, but with the soul. That Niels Tagle finished a prayer in English, seemingly unaware that anything strange had occurred, but when he looked up, he saw the room wasn't clapping, it was silent. As if no one knew what to do, a bishop from Chile stepped forward and whispered something in his ear. Tagle's smile faded. He stepped back from the lectern later that night. He would say privately to a trusted aide, "I remember beginning the prayer, and then I remember light, not light I saw." But one I heard back in Rome, the Vatican Secretariat for Communication received multiple recordings from the Congress organizers. They were asking if what had occurred was known, approved, or documented. It was not the dicastery for evangelization. Quietly passed the files along to a small intertheological commission specializing in linguistic anomalies, mostly cases of unexplainable speech events in historical saints' lives. The team analyzed the audio. The frequency pattern matched no known human language. Even AI transcription models failed to identify a root or correlate structure. But the waveform was strikingly symmetrical, almost musical. One analyst compared it to the overtone of a chauffeur, the ancient ram's horn used in Hebrew tradition, but lower and more structured. In a confidential memo sent to Pope Leo, the first 14 to commission summarized their findings in one unnerving line. The sound structure suggests it was not a language meant to be spoken, but one meant to be heard only. Once Cardinal Tagle, meanwhile, had returned to Rome, but something had changed. He became unusually quiet, skipping scheduled appointments, declining interviews, and spending hours in the chapel of the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, his former office. One morning, Sister Magda, the housekeeper, who had cleaned that chapel for over 25 years, entered with fresh linens and found him kneeling, eyes open, lips unmoving. But the room was echoing, no source, no visible speaker, yet the sound that same. Strange cadence was vibrating in the air like it was alive. When she dropped the cloth, the sound stopped. Tagle turned to her and whispered with tears in his eyes, "It's not tongue, it's a summoning." 3 days later, in the Vatican Library, a Dominican priest researching ancient Aramaic fragments stumbled upon an obscure parchment, never catalogued before. It was a copy of a letter attributed to a first-century Christian written to a scribe in Damascus. The letter contained a single untranslated phrase. At the top, written in script no known scholar had ever fully deciphered. When the priest heard a leaked recording of Tagle's strange utterance from Lisbon, he nearly collapsed. It matched not phonetically, not alphabetically, but rhythmically, beat for beat. It was as if the sound in Lisbon had resurrected a voice lost to time. He reported the match to his superior, who quietly reached out to the Secretary of State, the question hanging in the air: had Cardinal Tagle spoken the voice of someone from the time of Christ? Later, alone in his quarters, Cardinal Tagle sat before his breviary, but he didn't open it. He simply stared at the crucifix and whispered, "What did you let me say?" The crucifix did not speak, but the second hand on the wall clock behind him, according to his assistant's sworn account, stopped for exactly 3 seconds, then ticked forward again. Cardinal Tagle kept the details of what happened in Lisbon himself, but in the days following his return to Rome, he found himself drawn to places he hadn't tread in years, forgotten corners of the city, old chapels, and quiet stairways within the Vatican that held no official significance. One such place was the Oratorio de Croce Senziosa, a small underground chapel near the Scala Santa Fe, knew it even existed, had no relics, no famous art, no altar, just a stone cross carved into the back wall, ancient, unadorned. And cracked through its base, Tagle entered the ortry just after dawn. He didn't bring his breviary, no assistance. Follow the air inside was cool and dry, and the silence seemed to press against him like a hell breath. He knelt, and once again he heard it, not through his ears, but within a rhythm of pulse. Almost like a breath beneath the world older than speech, yet waiting to be spoken this time. He didn't try to stop it, his lips moved, but not a zone will a single sentence emerge, deep, slow, impossible. To translate, the words sounded like wind brushing through hollow stone. And when he finished, the light inside the chapel shifted, not brighter, not darker, just to where a whisper filled the room, not from outside, not from within him, but all around you. Remembered what was never taught. He opened his eyes. The cross on the wall, once cracked, was now holed back at the castestery, for the doctor of the faith theologians had convened an unofficial commission to review what they now referred to as the Lisbon phenomenon. It was not public, not yet. They called in linguist biblical scholars, and even one Jesuit physicist. Each was asked the same question: could a person speak a language never learned, never written, never recorded, and have it be real? Most answered, no. But one Father Miguel Elazar, a Maronite priest and expert in Proto-Semitic languages, disagreed. I've seen this before. He said everyone turned. He opened a folder and produced a photo of a cave wall in Syria, a faded inscription dating back. Before Christ, the symbols, almost erased by time, matched the phonetic contour of the audio from Tagle's speech, not the letters, not the vocabulary, but the rise and fall of the syllables, the breath patterns, the sacred rhythm. This isn't a language, he said, it's a vocal liturgy, something that was once used not to communicate with others, but to reach someone beyond time. The Pope was informed. Pope Leo the first 14th listened quietly to the recordings. He had them played 3 times. Then he made a private note in his own hand. The language isn't ancient, it's eternal. That's why no one remembers learning it. He summoned Cardinal Tagle. The two met privately in the Domus Sancti Marti, away from cameras. Impressed, Tagle entered. Pale and tired Leo stood. No greetings, no formality. He handed Tagle a folded parchment. On it was a single line: did you speak it, or were you spoken to? Tagle didn't answer immediately. Finally, he looked up and said, I think I gave my voice to someone who had no tongue left on earth. The Pope nodded, and what did he say? Tagle closed his eyes and whispered, he's asking if we've forgotten his name, not just in speech, but in witness. Later that evening, Tagle sat in the chapel of the Pontifical Filipino College, staring at the candle near the tabernacle. The chapel had long been a refuge for him, a place of simplicity, of silence, of heart. And then, for a second time, it came the voice, but this time he saw something too, a brief, radiant outline near the crucifix, not a figure, not an image. A shadow of light, as if something had entered the room that did not wish to be seen, only felt. He dropped to his knees. And then the second sentence came, not out loud, not internal, but into him. The language of heaven is not lost, it waits in silence until a soul is quiet enough to remember. The next morning, 3 Vatican translators submitted an unusual joint request. They wished to resign from interpreting Tagle's homilies when asked why. One replied, we are no longer interpreting him, we are interrupting something sacred. At the Congregation for the Causes of Saints, a secretary discovered an untranslated letter buried in the archive, written by Blessed and Catherine Emmerich nearly 200 years ago. It read, there will come a voice through a priest from the east, speaking not his tongue, but the cry of the soul before the fall of Eden. And when it happens, the sky will stop moving for a breath, and then it will begin again in the direction of return. Unaware of the discovery, Tagle boarded a train to AC. He hadn't told anyone, no assistant, no bishop, no press, just a small leather Bible in his hands, and one sentence on a slip of paper tucked inside: speak only when the silence is full enough to carry him. He closed his eyes as the train moved through the countryside, and once again, at exactly 9:58 a.m., he whispered, without meaning to a phrase no one else in the cabin understood, but the child across the aisle turned and looked at him with awe and said to his mother, he just said God's name. The early morning mist hovered over Assisi like a veil. It clung to the stone streets and olive branches, wrapping the town in silence. When Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle stepped off the train, no press was waiting, no clergy had been alerted. He walked alone, carrying nothing but his Bible and a folded paper marked only with cross drawn in red ink. The guards of the Basilica of St. Francis recognized him, but said nothing. He had no schedule, no tour, no public prayer intentions, only a quiet request: I need to be where he knelt. They led him to the lower crypt, the tomb of St. Francis. Tagle stood before the marble slab for a long time before kneeling. He did not speak. He didn't even close his eyes. He simply lowered his head and listened. And then, as he would later describe the space, bent not the air, not the floor, but the sense of place, he no longer felt he was in Assisi. He felt as if he had stepped aside to make room for something older. Then geography and memory, not his own, rose in his heart. He could see the saint kneeling in rags, bleeding from unseen wounds, saying nothing, yet the silence was full. And then, like the return of breath of sound, came a tone not from outside him, but through him, 3 syllables spoken not with voice, but with soul. He didn't understand them, but he knew them, because his heart trembled not in fear, but in recognition. He had spoken a name, not a name the name, and as he did the candle near Street Francis's tomb, enclosed oil flame protected behind glass flickered. Backward back in Rome, Pope Leo the 14th was seated in his private study, reviewing transcripts of historical reports on glossalia instances of supernatural speech. In saints' lives, none resembled what had happened with Tagle, because those instances involved people speaking to others. What happened with Tagle wasn't communication. It was transmission. The Pope turned to Father Dario, a young priest assigned to assist in documenting spiritual anomalies. Have we misunderstood Pentecost? Leo asked. Father Dario blinked. Holy Father. Leo leaned forward, his voice low. We think it was about languages, but what if it was about the readiness of the human soul to hold something too vast for words? Meanwhile, in the archive beneath the Lateran Basilica, a digital technician working late on manuscript digitization noticed something odd. A medieval commentary from a 13th century Franciscan friar, long believed to be incomplete, suddenly displayed a faded line of ink that hadn't been visible before he enhanced the image. It read, "The final tongue shall come not to teach but to echo." The entry was dated 1226. The year St. Francis died in AC Tagle, remained in the crypt for over 2 hours. No one disturbing the basilica was nearly empty. But at exactly 9:58 a.m. a nun in the upper church, dusting near the choir stalls, heard something. She could not explain. A wind, not outside, not in the rafters, but rising from the floor. It circled once and was gone when she checked the crypt camera feed. Later, she noticed that the digital clock in the corner froze for 3 seconds, exactly as the wind. Past Tagle emerged from the basilica silently, but his hands were trembling. A pilgrim on the steps asked if he was all right. He looked at her and smiled faintly, then said, "I heard him inhale." That's all, just inhale. That evening back in Rome, Cardinal Tagle met privately with Pope Leo. He had brought with him an ancient Ethiopian chant scroll found in Axum decades ago. It had never been translated successfully, but when he played a recording of Tagle's Lisbon prayer near the scroll's ink faint and brittle began to darken. Not all of it, only one line, a line previously unreadable, now visible, written in gears. The voice that comes before thunder does not speak, it calls. Tagle looked up. The scroll responds to the sound. Pope Leo nodded, and then said something no one expected. What if the voice is calling not just to us, but to God himself in Manila? The news of the Lisbon event had not reached the public. The Vatican had issued no comment. But in a small chapel near Quiapo Church, an elderly street vendor entered for the first time in 20 years in Manila. The news of the Lisbon event had not reached the public. The Vatican had issued no comment. But in a small chapel near Quiapo Church, an elderly street vendor entered for the first time in 20 years. She told the sacristan, "I don't know why. I just heard a voice say, he spoke my name, go back." She wept at the tabernacle. That night, Tagle returned to Rome in silence. As he walked through the quiet halls of the Clio Filippino, the chapel light flickered. He turned to the crucifix, and this time he spoke in his own voice. "I don't know what I said, but I know it was true." Then he sat down alone and for the first time in his life wrote nothing in his journal. Only a single mark, a circle open at the top, like a mouth waiting to breathe again. The next morning in Rome, Cardinal Tagle received an unmarked envelope slipped beneath the door of his residence. It contained no letterhead, no stamps, and no return address, just a single parchment, and a pressed olive branch on the parchment was one sentence: "Your voice is now part of something older than time." He stared at the paper for minutes before folding it and placing it inside his Bible. He didn't show it to anyone, but something in the room had shifted, as if the air itself had become aware of what had just entered. Outside, the birds over the Vatican gardens fell completely silent for 3 full minutes, recorded by a Vatican biologist working near the western wall. When asked about it later, she simply said, "It was like the world stopped to hear something we couldn't." At 10 a.m., Tagle visited the Vatican Observatory's archive at Castel Gandolfo. It was an unusual request, and it was granted without question. He asked to view audio data from deep space probes, especially frequency bursts, and sound anomalies that had never been decoded. The Jesuit astronomer in charge was skeptical, but respectful. He allowed Tagle into the private lab and played him a file discovered in 2000. 18, an unknown signal picked up by a Vatican satellite, pointed toward the Carina constellation. It lasted exactly 3.003 seconds. When the sound played, Tagle closed his eyes. He didn't understand the signal, not intellectually, but his body did. His arms tingled, his spine straightened, and most unsettling of all, his breathing matched the sound. When the playback ended, he whispered, without knowing why, "That's the breath, that's the one he took before he spoke through me." The astronomer asked, "Who is he?" Teller replied, "The one whose voice broke Eden and is calling it back." Back in the dicaster for evangelization, an internal memo was being circulated quietly, its title Recurrent Glossalic Activation. In a cardinal-level subject, theologians, linguists, and archivists contributed to the report. A mysterious pattern had emerged each instance in which Cardinal Tagle entered certain states, whether through prayer reflection or unexplainable utterances, coincided with localized environmental shifts. At first, they had dismissed these as coincidences, but over 10 cases now had timestamps verified by multiple witnesses, clocks stopping for 3 seconds, sudden reversals of ambient air flow, unaccountable temperature drops, or rises, short-lived auditory anomalies that left no physical trace, but were felt by those present. The margin of the memo one Jesuit had written, "It's as if creation is pausing to listen." At noon that day, Pope Leo I XIV convened a private conversation with 3 key figures, Cardinal Peter Ticin's sister Elizabetha, and a Dominican scholar named Father Jerome Lazel. They discussed not theology, but urgency. "Something is being spoken," Leo said quietly, "and it is not meant for the ears of only one man," Ticcin added. "But the language isn't this earth. How can the earth understand it?" Lazel leaned forward and answered, "Because it isn't meant to be heard, it's meant to be recognized." Meanwhile, in Manila, reports quietly surfaced that several school children at a Catholic orphanage had begun humming a melody they said came from a dream. None of them were musically trained, but when a local seminarian recorded the melody and ran it through a tonal analysis software, it matched the same audio shape as Tagle's speech in Lisbon, though slowed down and fragmented. When shown the recording, one child simply said, "It's the song he started but didn't finish." That evening, Tagle returned once again to the chapel in the Colegio Filipino. This time, he brought nothing but a folded linen cloth he placed on the altar and began to pray, not in his mind, not with his voice, but with the silence around him. And then once again it began. His lips moved, no sound emerged, but every candle in the chapel flickered inward, then outward in perfect rhythm with his breath. The CCTV camera watching the hallway glitched for 3 seconds. When the guards reviewed the footage, they found the timestamp frozen 9:58 p.m. Back inside the chapel, Tagle felt something rising, not panic, not fear, but urgency. He felt as if someone not himself was preparing to say something that would not be allowed to be said aloud. The breath began to build. He opened his mouth, but before any sound could escape, the wind outside howled for exactly 3 seconds, and all the candles went out. When he left the chapel, he was visibly shaken. He wrote, "Nothing, spoke to no one, but in his pocket was a new note." He didn't know how it got there. It said, "You were not stopped, you were shielded. Some words are not ready to be returned to the earth." Back in the Pope's quarters, Leo the 14th knelt before the tabernacle. He, too, had begun waking each morning at 9:58. Without fail, he opened the Gospel of John, and the page turned itself to 176. "I have revealed your name to those you gave me out of the world." He closed the book slowly, then whispered, "The name is coming back." The next day began like the others, but the air inside Vatican City carried a strange tension, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakably heavy. Those who served at the Curia commented privately that it felt as though time itself was watching them. Clocks ticked, normally bells rang on cue, but a feeling had settled over the city. Something was about to be spoken or revealed at 9:58 a.m. in the chapel of the congregation. For the evangelization of peoples, a marble tile cracked. No one was in the room. No weight had fallen, but the sound, a sharp single break, was heard by 2 nuns and a secretary in the hallway. When they entered, they found a fissure running in the shape of a letter Alph, the Hebrew Alph. This was the 3rd instance in 2 weeks of the symbol appearing in connection with Cardinal Tagle. None had been intentional, none had an explanation. Tagle, meanwhile, sat alone at a side altar in St. Peter's Basilica. He wore no clerical garments, only a black coat and white shirt. His rosary lay coiled on the marble before him. His fingers did not move, his lips stayed closed. He had not spoken aloud since the candles extinguished the night before, but in his silence, Something was being formed. He felt it pressing not against his body, but from within his spirit, like a sentence assembling itself not from thought, but from memory, a memory older than him, older than the world. He stood walked to the bald and above St. Peter's tomb and knelt. He whispered something only the floor heard at the name Return's Eye. Well, not delayed in Jerusalem, a monk walking near the Wailing Wall stopped in his tracks. When his prayer shawl fluttered against the wind, a tourist captured a video for exactly 3 seconds. All movement in the square slowed, flags, birds, even the people steps later. That footage was analyzed and found to have an audio frequency embedded beneath the ambient sounds barely detectable, yet it matched the Lisbon recording from weeks before. Same breath length, same tonal rhythm, a whisper of something that was never supposed to be heard again in Rome. Pope Leo the 14th entered the Vatican archives without entourage. He asked to be left alone in the Sala del Ling Padut, a sealed room where recovered manuscripts of undeciphered alphabets are stored. Only 5 people have access. One of them, a Polish archivist, was told to open a room and stand outside. When the Pope entered the room, single electric light flickered twice and steadied. He spent 73 minutes inside. When he emerged, he carried nothing but he left the following words written in the visitor log. What was spoken once by Adam was broken by Cain, and whispered again by Abraham under breath. It is now returning not as sound, but as presence. That evening, Cardinal Tagle received a visit from Father Jerome Lazzle, the Dominican scholar. Working with the Pope, Lazzle carried a fragment of a lost Dead Sea Scroll, one of the few not yet made public. Its contents have been debated and feared for decades. Due to one line written in blood-colored ink, in the final age, the word will walk without form and borrow the breath of the willing. He placed a fragment on the table. Tagle didn't touch it. He only said, I'm not willing. I was listening, and it came. Law asked a question burning in every mind around the Pope. Who, or what is speaking through you? Tiger shook his head, then answered, It's not through me, it's to me. I just forgot that I knew how to listen. At 3 a.m., a private Vatican security camera near the bronze doors picked up an image that still defies explanation. For exactly 3 seconds, a shadow passed beneath the doorframe. Without light to cast, the guards reviewed the footage 19 times. No entry, no exit, only a movement. And then silence on the recording. A soundless pulse was captured. Analysts used spectrographic tools to convert to waveforms. A waveform, when matched against a Lisbon audio file, aligned exactly a signal not of speech but a returning breath. In Manila, a retired bishop awoke from a deep sleep with tears on his face. He called a nearby priest and said, It's coming back. The language that creation once understood. The priest asked him, Is it dangerous? He responded, No, but it's jealous. It doesn't want to be forgotten again. That same day, the Pope issued a private instruction. All Vatican audio equipment across sacred spaces must be calibrated for atmospheric resonance. No explanation, just obedience. And assigned chapel engineers installed a microphone near the center of the chapel, hidden within the floor tiles. When tested, it picked up a strange frequency just before dusk, a soft rhythmic pattern, like breathing through stone. Then 3 seconds of nothing, and then a phrase whispered across the data. Logs, Dom swam reverter. He has returned to his house. No one heard in the room, but the system recorded it without speakers at 9:58 p.m. That night, Cardinal Tagle opened his Bible to Book of Genesis. A wind moved through his room. He didn't turn the page turned itself, and on it the words seemed to rise slightly off the paper. And God said. That was all. The moment passed, and the air settled. But Tagle knew the name was not just coming. The name was ready in the quiet hours just before dawn, when Rome is still. Cloaked in mist, and the basilica bells have not yet stirred the streets, Cardinal Tagle returned to the Oratorio di Crescenziosa. No guard accompanied him, no record was made. Only the aged custodian noticed a silhouette pass by in the reflection of a bronze lamp inside the small chamber. Nothing had changed. The cracked stone cross still stood at the far wall. The air was cool, thick with centuries of silent prayer, but something invisible had altered. He could feel it the moment he stepped inside. There was no voice, no wind, no vision, but the air itself. It listened, not passively, not like a space. Holding still, was engaged. Tagle sat on the stone bench, closed his eyes, and said nothing. He simply allowed himself to become silent. And that was when the room responded. The same breath returned, not external, not imagined. It filled him, a cadence of rhythm, 3 slow pulses of something not made of air, but a presence. Then it came the first syllable. Not one he spoke, but one he released. It echoed in The space without sound, the second syllable low, almost weightless, did not exit his mouth, but rippled through his chest, and the third never made out it stopped at the edge of speech, because at that precise moment the crack in the stone cross healed silently, seamlessly 1 second. It was fractured. The next whole Tagle fell forward in awe. He did not weep, he breathed, and for the first time he understood the truth. This language does not describe God, it is the sound of him arriving in Vatican City. Pope Leo the XIV met quietly with only 2 individuals, the master of the Apostolic Palace and Sister Elizabetha. They reviewed 3 documents in silence, each sealed with the papal signate marked only to be opened in the event of unexplained vocal phenomena. The first had been authored by Pope Paul V, detailing a mass in 1967, where a French nun cried out words unknown to her during the elevation, later found to match a chant buried in a 1st-century Roman catacomb. The second by Pope Benedict I. 16th referenced an obscure Gregorian mode that appeared in a dream and later matched unknown cosmic pulses logged by the Vatican Observatory. But it was a third document penned in 2014 by Pope Francis that struck the most a single line: "The voice will return to one who carries light without knowing it, and that light will pierce time." Elizabetha asked softly, "Do we think Tagle is a one?" Pope Leo said only, "He's not the first to carry it, but he may be the first to carry it to the end." Later that day, Cardinal Tagle requested an unplanned audience with Pope Leo. It was granted immediately. They met not in the papal apartments, but in the Clementine Hall beneath fresco of the Ascension. Tagle entered holding a blank parchment. He knelt. Leo approached him. "What do you have?" Tagle raised the parchment. "There is no ink," he said, "but I saw this written." Pope Leo took the page, skeptical. It was indeed blank, but as the 2 men stood in the hall, the afternoon sun pierced the stained glass window behind them and hit the paper at a precise angle, and for 3 seconds a word appeared, faint gold trembling like light on water, not Latin, not Hebrew, not Greek. It was a single radiant form, resembling a crown made of flame. Pope Leo said almost inaudibly, "This is not a word, this is a summons." That evening an envelope was delivered discreetly to Cardinal Tagle's residence. No signature, no explanation. Inside a photo taken in 1917 in Fatima, Portugal, one that had been suppressed by Vatican archivists for over a century. It depicted 3 children, but in the background, almost invisible, was a blurred figure, mouth open, arms raised, not facing the children, but facing away toward the sky, written on the back in trembling handwriting. He said a name before the sun, Dance Tagle. Sat down staring at the image long after the sun had set that same night at the Pontifical Institute for Sacred Music. A professor reviewing ancient chant forms stumbled upon an anomaly. A single scale recorded centuries ago in Syria had no known origin or structure. When he played on a modern synthesizer and slowed it down, it produced not music, but pulse patterns. The patterns matched recent atmospheric anomalies around Rome. When the audio was played through resonance modeling software, a visual wave formed. It looked like an eye, and in the center, the waveform spelled unmistakably Alpha. At 9:58 p.m., Tagle stood at his window, eyes on the sky. He breathed in deeply, and as he exhaled for the first time, the breath did not return. It left him as if carried elsewhere, and with it, when the third syllable, the one he had never spoken, he whispered, "It was never meant for me to finish." Then he sat still and knew someone else was listening now. In the early hours of the next day, before the Roman sun could warm the stones of the colonnade, Cardinal Tagle awoke from a sleep that had felt more like a silence than a dream. His room was undisturbed, a lamp still burning faintly, yet his heart was racing, not from fear, but from certainty. He knew something had been heard. The third syllable, the one he had never spoken, the one that had left him the night before, was no longer his to carry somewhere. Someone else had received it. The feeling wasn't symbolic. It was real, a transfer as vivid as handing off a sacred object during Mass. The breath he hadn't inhaled had been accepted by another presence. He whispered aloud, "Who heard it?" Just before 10 a.m., a nun from Croatia entered the Vatican postulancy office, shaking and pale. She carried a letter she claimed had been given to her in a dream. She said it was dictated to her by a man whose face was made of light. The handwriting was hers. The words were not. She had no knowledge of Hebrew. Yet the paper she handed to the receptionist bore 3 characters ancient and seared into the parchment with a pressure that had not broken the page, only transformed at the final character. Matched no known script, but when scanned using Vatican linguistic software, the algorithm returned a single response, untranslatable, non-ear origin, perception-based semantic pattern. The room fell silent. Then the lead archivist asked a chilling question: what if that's not a word? What if it's how God hears his name when spoken by his creation? At noon, Pope Leo the first 14th convened a private discussion with Father Jerome Lazel and two unnamed theologians. He brought with him a sealed envelope he had received from Pontifical Academy of Sciences just hours earlier, inside a printout of electromagnetic anomalies recorded in 3 regions simultaneously: AC Jerusalem and northern Ethiopia. All occurred at precisely the same time, 9:58 p.m. Rome time. The patterns weren't random. When overlaid, they formed a triune shape perfectly aligned like a sacred triangle inscribed within a circle. More disturbing still, the pulse lengths from each region were divisible by 3 and occurred in a thrice repeating wave. The Pope looked at Lazel and said, "The language is not local, it's sacramental." Elsewhere in Rome, at the Gregorian University, a young theology student named Matteo was reviewing recordings of ancient Hebrew blessings when something odd occurred. As he reached the end of 15th century rabbinic chant, his computer glitched and replayed 3 seconds of an unrelated audio file. Matteo recognized it immediately. It was a Lisbon prayer Tagle's voice. He hadn't downloaded that file. The segment was brief, but after slowing it by a factor of 100, he noticed something impossible beneath the sound wave. A second voice could be heard, fainter, slower, more measured. It spoke just one word, no known language. But Matteo knew what it meant. Returned. He reported it to the Vatican's Commission for the Sacred. They confirmed the echo was not a result of reverberation or audio bleed. It was another voice speaking with Tagle, but not through him, as if the name once released had been answered. That evening, Cardinal Tagle visited Santa Maria Sopra Minerva. He sat alone beneath the shadow of Michelangelo's Creed the Redeemer. As he looked up, he noticed something subtle. The lips of the statue, long untouched, seemed what he reached out not with his hand, but with his heart. And then he heard a return breath. But it wasn't from the statue, it came from within him. And it was not as his eyes welled with tears. He stood slowly, bowed, and said he accepted it. Back at the Apostolic Palace, Pope Leo stood before the papal balcony, not to address the world, but to listen. The lights of Rome shimmered in the distance, the Tiber murmured below. He whispered into the air, who heard it, and for the first time a response came, not in sound, not in light, but in stillness. For 3 seconds a wind ceased, not slowed, ceased, and then it returned with a warmth that hadn't been there before. At the same moment, Cardinal Tagle returned to his room. On his pillow lay a single olive leaf. There was no window open, no one had entered. It was green, alive, fragrant, with something ancient tucked beneath. It was a handwritten line in Latin, not his handwriting, verbam out of it. Non-transit Manet, the word was. Heard it, did not pass, it remains. He sat down slowly, and for the first time since Lisbon, he wrote in his journal. It was not a message, it was recognition. He did not speak back. He simply made room for what he once placed in us long ago. In a secure wing of the Vatican archives, a quiet alarm blinked. Red, the sensor, designed only to activate in the presence of high-frequency atmospheric disruption, had recorded an anomaly. The file name saved automatically. As table speech answered, no one touched it, no one opened it, because some files are not meant to be read, only witnessed. The following morning, the Vatican gardens were unusually still, not just quiet, but unnaturally motionless. No breeze disturbed the cypress trees. Fountains seemed to trickle more slowly. The air, as described by one Swiss guard stationed at the edge of the path, felt like something sacred had just passed through. At exactly 9:58 a.m., the solar clock in the northern courtyard paused its shadow movement for 3 seconds. No cloud had covered the sun, no jet blocked its path, yet its shadow halted as if time had remembered something. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle was at prayer when it happened, kneeling in a private side chapel near the Apostolic Palace. This time, he wasn't trying to listen. He was simply waiting, and something entered the silence, a presence that didn't begin with sound, but with awareness. His heartbeat slowed, his breath deepened, and for the first time since Lisbon, the voice returned, but this time it didn't take. Over him, it stood beside him. He could feel like another person in the room, not external, not ghostly, but real. He didn't look, he didn't need it, he knew who it was. And then came a 4-syllable one that didn't belong to him at all, one he hadn't spoken, and wasn't meant to. He heard it inside his chest, not a sound of meaning, and it meant, I am here. That same morning, Pope Leo, the first 14th, canceled all meetings and asked to be taken alone to the Basilica of St. Mary Major. He entered through the side door and walked to the Solus Romani icon, the image of the Virgin Mary, believed to have miraculous powers, and carried through Rome during plagues. He stood before it without genuflecting. He simply whispered. He heard it, didn't he? The air did not answer, but the oil lamp beside the icon, steady for hours, suddenly flared upward, then settled. The Pope smiled faintly, then turned to the priest accompanying him and said, Tell no one what happened here. The name has been acknowledged. And that's enough for now. Elsewhere in the Vatican, a Jesuit linguist analyzing phonetic patterns from the Lisbon recording noticed an error in the metadata file of the original audio clip. Instead of atom stamp ending at 1436, it ended at 143,557 3 seconds missing. When he tried to isolate the gap, the waveform refused to play every attempt to process. That window of time returned a flat line as though sound itself had not existed in that interval, not silence, not distortion, non-existence the same. Result occurred with 4 different software programs. Finally, on a whim, he ran it through a Gregorian chant analysis tool, used a mapped tonal symmetry in ancient liturgies of program, produced a single graphic, a circle open at the top ringed with 3 marks. He froze. It matched the drawing Tagle had placed in his journal 2 weeks earlier. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, a statue of San Antonio in a small chapel near Cavite was seen by witnesses to tilt forward slightly during morning mass exactly as the priest read John 17, verse 6 aloud. I have revealed your name to those whom you gave me. The parishioners gasped, but none screamed, because in that moment everyone in the chapel felt return, as if something long lost had just come back home. Cardinal Tagle spent the rest of the day in solitude. He declined all calls. He refused an interview request from Vatican Radio in his room. He placed a blank parchment, now permanently bearing the golden flame symbol, into the center of his Bible. Then, at 9:58 p.m., he opened the window and faced the city, not to pray, not to speak, just to be present. And then he heard it again, the breath, not his own. This one came from the city, from the stones, from the trees, from the air itself. Creation exhaled, and the sound it made matched his own rhythm, as if the world had taken in what he released, and now was giving it back at the Vatican press office. A junior staffer, reviewing video archives of Tagle's Lisbon address, noticed a visual anomaly in frame 2315, just 2 frames before the speech. Change the pixels in the frame briefly formed a shadow behind. Tagle, one not cast by lights nor traceable to any object in the room. It looked like a veil pulled back. Behind it, nothing visible, only 3 small glimmers arranged in a triangle. Where his shoulders had just been, the staffer ran the frame through image-enhancing software. One word emerged from the noise pattern responder. It is answered. Pope Leo the First 14th, alone in his study, closed the book of Revelation and stood before the crucifix. He didn't speak, but after 3 seconds, the chain holding the cross swayed gently, though there was no wind. He smiled and quietly wrote in his journal. Not a miracle, not a prophecy, not a message, a reminder the name is not forgotten. We were the ones who stopped listening. Cardinal Tagle awoke on the 9th day, not to the sound of bells or birds, but to absolute stillness. There was no noise, no hum of distant traffic, no footsteps echoing through the stone hall. Outside his room, the silence was so total it felt intentional. He rose, slowly washed his face, and opened his Bible. The page fell to the Gospel of Luke 20 for the account of the disciples walking to Emmaus. Were not our hearts burning within us while he spoke to us on the road? Tagle closed the book, not needing to read. More that burning, he knew it now. It was not emotional. It was not poetic. It was a physical reality when heaven was near. And today he felt again, but not in himself, in the world. At 9:58 a.m., a small group of seminarians in Cov gathered for prayer in a chapel known for T.S. silence. One of them, reading quietly from Isaiah, stopped mid-verse and stared ahead with wide eyes. He had heard nothing yet. Every word on the page had suddenly vanished for 3 seconds. The page was blank, then the ink reappeared. No one believed him until the video footage from a surveillance camera confirmed. At the same time, stamped the lights in the chapel dimmed, and then pulsed once, twice, 3 times. Later, the seminarian was asked what verse he had been reading. When the words disappeared, he replied, Isaiah 43, verse 1. I have called you by name, you are mine. Meanwhile, in Rome, Pope Leo the First 14 spent the morning not in meetings, but walking silently through the Vatican gardens. His hands were clasped behind his back rosary, hanging loosely between his fingers. He paused near the Grotto of Lourdes replica, a place normally filled with flowers and the sound of water. Today it was quiet. He closed his eyes and felt something gentle move past his face, like a whisper, without words, and then the sound returned, not outside, within the air itself. It was not a voice, it was a pressure of fullness, as if heaven had drawn near, not to speak, but to receive. That same afternoon, Cardinal Tagle received a letter hand delivered by a Franciscan friar. The envelope was ancient, sealed not with wax, but with a pressed imprint of olive bark. Inside was a page, yellowed, but strong. It bore one sentence in Aramaic, scribbled with what appeared to be a sharpened red. The breath given Adam has not expired, it has only been waiting. Tiger stared at the writing, heart pounding. The Handwriting matched nothing in any archive, but the ink had not faded, it was fresh alive, and when he held it, he could feel the same rhythm in his hands that he had felt in his chest during the Lisbon event, a heartbeat, 3 pulses, and stillness. Then again in the Dominican Republic, a child in a mission school began speaking during morning prayer, not in Spanish, but in a language no one had heard before. Calmly, slowly, with her eyes closed, she said 12 words. They meant nothing to her teachers, but when the audio was sent to a Jesuit in Rome, he immediately matched it to the sound signature of Tagle's mysterious phrase. And then, after spectral analysis, the following pattern was discovered. Every third word emitted a light frequency invisible to the eye, but detectable by thermal instruments. The Vatican's linguistics department issued a private internal note. This is not a language for the ears, this is a light-based resonance. Pattern words, yes, but only to the degree that music is words. It is a communion of memory and presence. At 9:58 p.m., Cardinal Tagle stood again at his window, as he had each night since returning to Rome. But this time a knock came at the door. He opened it to find no one, only a folded cloth on the floor. Unfolding it, he saw a single symbol stitched in golden thread. It was a circle again, open at the top. But this time something was different. Above the open part of the circle hovered a flame. Small, barely perceptible, but burning. Tagle placed the cloth over his Bible. And sat, he whispered, "He has received it." And the moment he spoke those words, every candle in his room flickered inward, not from wind, but from something drawing and drawing near. That same night, a nun praying in the Basilica of the Holy Cross in Jerusalem recounted hearing a distant sound so faint she thought it a dream. It wasn't a voice, it was a sound of exhalation, a breath, not a man, not a wind, but something immense. When she reported it, she was asked if it felt holy. She answered, "No, it felt returned, as if something we gave had finally come back to us." In the control room of the Vatican Observatory, an astronomer monitoring deep space radio signals noticed a minor anomaly from the region of the Triangulum Galaxy. For 3 seconds the signal stopped, not faded, stopped. When it resumed, the first wave carried the precise tonal pattern of Tagle's voice from Lisbon reversed and slowed to 1,000th of its speed. Only one sentence could be reconstructed from its reformation. He remembers what we forgot. Cardinal Tagle, exhausted, but at peace, wrote only one line in his journal before closing it for the night. "The word that came through me was not for the world. It was for the one who made it." And he listened. It was just past midnight in Rome, when Pope Leo the 14th was awakened not by a knock nor by noise, but by the distinct feeling that he had been called. There was no voice in his ear, no dream, but his spirit knew it had been addressed. He rose without hesitation, dressed simply in a black cassock, and walked alone to the chapel within the apostolic palace. There, before the Eucharist, he knelt and closed his eyes, and in that moment the Pope, who had led millions, who had studied thousands of books and endured decades of formation, felt like a child again, because he could feel that something was coming back, not as a messenger, not even as an answer, but as a presence the Church had spoken of for 2 millennia, and yet never fully grasped a breath older. An history, a name that had waited to be said not by lips, but by the heart of creation itself. At 9:58 a.m., something extraordinary happened across 5 continents, in small chapels, cathedrals, forests, hospitals, convents, and even city streets. People of faith and people of no faith had all paused, without knowing why. An organist stopped pressing keys. Mid a nurse paused while tending to a patient. A young atheist student walking across a campus in Brazil halted mid-step and later said, "It felt like..." The sky took a breath. The phenomenon lasted only 3 seconds, but sensors across the globe recorded the same anomaly. Barometric pressure changed by a fraction. Radio silence spiked. Even in active zones, light in certain rooms shifted direction ever so slightly. It was, as one Vatican scientist described, as if something immense exhaled not outward, but toward us. In Rome, Cardinal Tagle knelt in the crypt of St. Peter's Basilica, directly beneath the high altar. He had come there without announcement, escorted by no one with him. Was the cloth bearing the golden flame, and the journal where he recorded all that had transpired since Lisbon. He did not pray, he listened, and what he heard was everything. The breath that had once passed through him returned, not in sound, but in recognition. He knew what was being given back. It wasn't a message, it wasn't prophecy. It was remembrance, creation. For a brief moment, remembered God's name, not in speech and being. And then Tagle spoke. Not aloud, not even mentally, but through every cell in his body. Amen. At that exact moment, a tremor barely detectable rippled through the earth beneath Rome. It didn't register on seismographs, but the Vatican's underground sensors logged a single vibration lasting 3 seconds. It formed a perfect triangle, the same shape that had appeared in the electromagnetic overlays from Ethiopia, Jerusalem. And AC, the pattern was unmistakable. 3 pulses, 1 response, 1 unity. That Evening Pope Leo the XIV issued a brief private note to his closest circle of advisors. Nothing more is needed. What was spoken through Cardinal Tagle was not for interpretation, but for reunion. Let the world wonder, let theologians study, but we the shepherds must know. The shepherd heard his sheep, and he responded, and Manila pilgrims who had never heard of the events in Rome began coming to churches in unexpected numbers. Confessions increased, Eucharistic adoration, chapels stayed full long past there. Scheduled hours, no announcement was made, no broadcast drew them in when asked. Why they came, many gave the same answer. I don't know, I just felt called, like something holy was reaching out to me. Cardinal Tagle remained silent for 7 days, no interviews, no statements. When he finally returned to the Vatican press room, he gave only a single reflection. No transcript was issued, but one journalist wrote later that it felt as if the words coming from him weren't just chosen, they were remembered from before language existed. He ended the short address with this: we spend our lives trying to speak to God, but once, just once, he let one of us speak in a way he remembered us from beginning. I was only the heir. The word had always been, as the Vatican made no formal declaration about the Lisbon event or about the phenomena that followed, but one detail was quietly added to the record in the secret archives under a new category. Cyril reverted the speech that returned. The entry bears no commentary. Only one line, 958. He listened in the Clio Filipino, the room where Tagle had first spoken. The mysterious phrase was left untouched. The candles had never been RIT. The cloth with the golden flame was folded and placed in a glass case marked only with a Latin inscription, Verbum Spiritus Silentium. The word that breath of silence. No further explanation was given. None was needed, because those who came to see it did not ask questions. They simply knelt, and sometimes in those sacred 3 seconds of stillness they too felt heard. No one expected anything unusual that Wednesday afternoon at the International Pastoral Congress in Lisbon. It was the final day of the event, and Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, known for his warm presence, humble smile, and sharp theological insights, had just finished delivering a talk on synodality, and listening to the peripheries of the church. The room of over 300 delegates stood in applause. He nodded, graciously preparing to offer a closing prayer in English. As usual, a multilingual team was on standby for translation, but then it happened, something no one could explain, not even Cardinal Tagle himself. As he bowed his head, hands folded on the lectern, his voice deepened slightly, not in tone, but in weight, and the first words he spoke were not in English, Latin, Tagalog, Italian, or any language he was known to speak. It was something else. The room grew still. People stopped taking notes. Heads lifted. One translator near the front froze. Dropping her pen, another began weeping without understanding. Why the words were clear, pronounced slowly with no hesitation, but utterly unrecognizable. Some described it as sounding ancient, others said it resembled a Semitic language, or perhaps something older than Hebrew itself. But what shook the room was what happened after several audience members, none seated near each other, began whispering translations. Each swore they heard the phrase in their own language: Portuguese, French, Swahili, Tagalog. Different languages, but the same message. The name is spoken not with the tongue, but with the soul. That Niels Tagle finished a prayer in English, seemingly unaware that anything strange had occurred, but when he looked up, he saw the room wasn't clapping, it was silent, as if no one knew what to do. A bishop from Chile stepped forward and whispered something in his ear. Tagle smile faded. He stepped back from the lectern later that night. He would say privately to a trusted aide, I remember beginning the prayer, and then I remember light, not light I saw, but one I heard. Back in Rome, the Vatican Secretariat for Communication received multiple recordings from the Congress organizers. They were asking if what had occurred was known, approved, or documented. It was not the dicastery for evangelization quietly passed the files along to a small internal theological commission specializing in linguistic anomalies, mostly cases of unexplainable speech events in historical saints' lives. The team analyzed the audio. The frequency pattern matched no known human language. Even AI transcription models failed to identify a root or correlate structure, but the waveform was strikingly symmetrical, almost musical. One analyst compared it to the overtone of a chauffeur, the ancient ram's horn used in Hebrew tradition, but lower and more structured. In a confidential memo sent to Pope Leo the first 14 to commission summarized their findings in one unnerving line. The sound structure suggests it was not a language meant to be spoken, but one meant to be heard only. Once Cardinal Tagle, meanwhile, had returned to Rome, but something had changed. He became unusually quiet, skipping scheduled appointments, declining interviews, and spending hours in the chapel of the Congregation for the Evangelization of People's former office. One morning, Sister Magda, the housekeeper, who had cleaned that chapel for over 25 years, entered with fresh linens and found him kneeling, eyes open, lips unmoving, but the room was echoing, no source, no visible speaker, yet the sound that same. Strange cadence was vibrating in the air like it was alive. When she dropped the cloth, the sound stopped. Tagle turned to her and whispered with tears in his eyes, "It's not tongue, it's a summoning." 3 days later in the Vatican Library, a Dominican priest researching ancient Aramaic fragments stumbled upon an obscure parchment never catalogued before. It was a copy of a letter attributed to a first-century Christian written to a scribe in Damascus. The letter contained a single untranslated phrase. At the top, written in script no known scholar had ever fully deciphered, when the priest heard a leaked recording of Tagle's strange utterance from Lisbon. He nearly collapsed. It matched not phonetically, not alphabetically, but rhythmically, beat for beat. It was as if the sound in Lisbon had resurrected a voice lost to time. He reported the match to his superior, who quietly reached out to the Secretary of State, the question hanging in the air. Had Cardinal Tagle spoken the voice of someone from the time of Christ? Later, alone in his quarters, Cardinal Tagle sat before his breviary, but he didn't open it. He simply stared at the crucifix and whispered, "What did you let me say?" The crucifix did not speak, but the second hand on the wall clock behind him, according to his assistant's sworn account, stopped for exactly 3 seconds, then ticked forward again. Cardinal Tagle kept the details of what happened in Lisbon himself, but in the days following his return to Rome, he found himself drawn to places he hadn't touched in years, forgotten corners of the city, old chapels, and quiet stairways within the Vatican that held no official significance. One such place was the Oratorio de Croce Senziosa, a small underground chapel near the Scala. Santa Fe knew it even existed. It had no relics, no famous art, no altar, just a stone cross carved into the back wall, ancient, unadorned, and cracked through its base. Tagle entered the oratory just after dawn. He didn't bring his breviary, no assistance. Followed. The air inside was cool and dry, and the silence seemed to press against him like a hell breath. He knelt, and once again he heard it, not through his ears, but within a rhythm, a pulse. Almost like a breath beneath the world, older than speech, yet waiting to be spoken this time. He didn't try to stop it. His lips moved, but not his own. Will a single sentence emerged, deep, slow, impossible to translate. The words sounded like wind brushing through hollow stone. And when he finished, the light inside the chapel shifted, not brighter, not darker, just aware a whisper filled the room, not from outside, not from within him, but all around you. Remembered what was never taught. He opened his eyes. The cross on the wall, once cracked, was now holed back at the castestery, for the doctor of the faith. Theologians had convened an unofficial commission to review what they now referred to as the Lisbon phenomenon. It was not public, not yet. They called in linguists, biblical scholars, and even one Jesuit physicist. Each was asked the same question: could a person speak a language never learned, never written, never recorded, and have it be real? Most answered, no. But one Father Miguel Elazar, a Maronite priest and expert in Proto-Semitic languages, disagreed. "I've seen this before." He said. Everyone turned. He opened a folder and produced a photo of a cave wall in Syria, a faded inscription dating back before Christ. The symbols, almost erased by time, matched the phonetic contour of the audio from Tagle's speech, not the letters, not the vocabulary, but the rise and fall of the syllables, the breath patterns, the sacred rhythm. "This isn't a language," he said. "It's a vocal liturgy, something that was once used not to communicate with others, but to reach someone beyond time." The Pope was informed. Pope Leo the First 14th listened quietly to the recordings. He had them played 3 times. Then he made a private note in his own hand. The language isn't ancient, it's eternal. That's why no one remembers learning it. He summoned Cardinal Tagle. The two met privately in the